Welcome to Ripple Effect. I am Chris Byers of FORMSTACK. This episode, we're focused on an area that many of us are starting to explore, and it's the low-code, no-code space. And Nile Frater is on the show today to really teach us a little bit more about the no-code space, how it's evolving, how it's enabling teams across organizations to do really better work. And Nile is the head of engineering strategy at Lloyds Banking Group. He's also the managing director at Concrete Capital and owner of NoCode.tech. Nile, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Now, I've got a terrible American accent that I'm sure I did not pronounce your name right. So tell the world how you're really supposed to say it.
Yeah, it's pronounced Nile. There's a lot of debate over that because technically I am named after the river in Egypt. So people kind of debate how you pronounce that, but I pronounce it Nile. Most people pronounce it Nile.
All right. Well, I know we in the U.S. are not well regarded for our the sophistication in our words. So I appreciate that. Well, maybe you could jump in for us and really define for us. Tell us maybe the difference between low code and no code for the audience who's listening and really trying to understand this space. Can you describe that?
Yeah, totally. So I'll start with low code as it's probably the easier one. So low code is still very much coding, very much used by developers, but typically lets you speed up the things that you do a lot but take a lot of time. Think how many engineers in the world have built a login interface or a forgotten password feature. Low code is really, really good at abstracting away these things that you do again and again, or letting you build things once so that your kind of fellow developers can reuse that. No code, on the other hand, is for me a real paradigm shift. So no code is traditionally an ecosystem of tools and platforms that allow you to create reusable software without actually writing any code. You're still essentially coding under the hood, but you're doing it completely by a drag and drop visual interface. You're connecting things together. You're using different tools to connect services. And where I think no code is really, really interesting is, given the name, no code, people use it primarily to refer to building an app or building a website. But really what no code is doing for me is it's taking something that used to be done by professionals, software engineers in this case, and it's making it easy and accessible. And actually, there are a lot of tools which make, say, for example, podcasting easier. They make it easier to record, to edit, to mix. They make things like video editing easier. They make things like graphic design easier. I consider all these things to fall under the umbrella of no code. For me, no code is about taking complicated software-related tasks on a computer and making that essentially accessible to the 99%.
So tell us a little bit about how you found the no-code, low-code space and how you got interested in it.
I actually am originally a coder. I've been coding probably since I was 8 or 9 years old, something like that. And I first got my start because I was really interested in hacking. And my kind of claim to fame, for example, was hacking all the computers in my school and almost getting expelled. But as I kind of grew up a little bit and started to learn more about actual software and less about hacking tools, I really began to get an interest in product and marketing and this kind of thing. And I quickly found that for me, coding was becoming a bit of a chore. I was really, really interested in the end goal, the product or the app that I might code, but I really hated the process. I hated sitting there 2 nights in a row, wondering why my software wouldn't work, and then finally finding a missing colon or a missing quotation or something like that. And if there's any programmers listening or anyone who has tried that before, you'll be really familiar with that experience. So around the time, 2014, something like that, I discovered tools like Webflow, I discovered tools like Treeline, etc. And I found that these tools would essentially let me either, write code faster or do the bits I wasn't good at. Just because you can code doesn't necessarily mean you are good at designing interfaces or making that kind of thing work. And what no-code tools are really good at is not only do they simply take away coding, but also they tend to help you do things like design, like making a back end work quickly, or even taking away having to worry about infrastructure in the first place. And so what I quickly found is I really cared about building products, and no code essentially abstracted away everything that stood between me and building a product to get into customers' hands.
Well, tell us what's going on in this space. What are you seeing happen?
In a word, explosions. So the size of the space that kind of over the last kind of couple of years. I mean, the growth's just been incredible. I've been in what I would call the no-code space since probably around 2014. I think my first real taste of it was when Webflow launched, and I started kind of playing with that back in the early days. And, most people would kind of say no-code's a concept that's been around for a very, very long time. And you maybe remember a tool called Adobe Dreamweaver, which kind of let you build websites with a bit of a drag and drop interface, still a fair bit of code involved. But really, since kind of 2017, 2018 onwards, the space is growing and more tools have started to come in, and the real kind of concept of no-code started to evolve. Back in 2014, 2015, you really needed to know how to code if you wanted to stitch together the 3 or 4 tools that existed. Whereas today and now, you pretty much have new companies coming out every single day. I mean, if you look on producthunt.com and scroll down, there was a no-code company that launched yesterday that hit the top spot. There's literally no-code companies launching every single day. They've got new capabilities. They've got new integrations with tools or new use cases that you couldn't use before. And, a lot of people sort of refer to no-code as having a real kind of 80-20 problem where you can accomplish 80% of what you want without code, but to really get to that last 20%, at some point you've got to get a developer. And in some ways I agree with that, but what I find is literally every week, every month, new tools are coming out, and that 80-20 is becoming 90-10, 95-5, and so on and so forth.
Where do you see, you actually probably mentioned a little bit of this, which is this idea that the tools that are out there now are getting people closer and closer to really producing what they're looking for. So what do you think the future is? What do you think the next few years are going to look like?
So I think part of it is really just building on what we've got today. I mean, there's so many things that have come out, in the last year, like Adalo or Parabola, and for people who don't know, Adalo makes mobile apps. Parabola essentially kind of lets you drag and drop data science, or otherwise do things you would usually do with Excel. That's probably been unfair, but we'll stick with that. These kind of tools are just coming out. People are just starting to scratch the surface of what's actually possible with them. And I think importantly, kind of, where the space is starting to go is as more and more of these tools come out, they're starting to integrate with each other. Bubble, for example, which is probably the best known app builder out there, just integrated with Airtable, which is kind of the best known sort of database. It feels like a spreadsheet, that kind of thing. But as more and more of these integrations come out, the things that you're able to do, the things you're able to create, the services you're able to connect, every single time one of these connections becomes possible, there's literally exponential growth in terms of what you can build without without coding or with no code, and what you can kind of achieve. So, I think there's a really, really exciting just growth that we're just waiting to see there. And I think on top of that as well, people are going to evolve in terms of their understanding. When you learn to code, you, as I sort of touched on earlier, you learn concepts like how to connect to APIs, how logic works, how to do an if statement where if this one thing happens, then you do something else, all these kind of fundamental blocks that let you build software. And a lot of people who are coming into no code don't necessarily understand that yet. They're just dragging and dropping around an interface, figuring out how something works. But actually, over time, as they start to play with these tools and they start to learn more about coding concepts and apply them visually, the things that these people are going to be able to achieve, the things that they're going to be able to turn into templates and tutorials and guides and share with other people, it's going to be immense. And I think you're going to start to see the same increase that you've seen over the last 10 years in terms of what tech could do in 2010 versus 2020. You're going to see that in the no-code space as well, and more is going to become possible.
Well, I'm curious, as I think about our own product, one of the things I will tell people is, it can be used by absolutely anybody and any company anywhere, but there's a huge problem. And that really is it coming to mind when you have a problem. So if you have a problem and we happen to intersect you at the right time, that's going to work out great. But I'm curious what you're learning as you're trying to introduce no code into kind of an organization, because I feel like that's got to be one of the most challenging places to get people to stop and say, oh, I'm not going to do the normal things I do when I want to solve a problem, like call IT or do it in Excel. I'm going to try to advance this a little bit. How are you kind of learning what's working there?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And I think the biggest problem, and I have this both, internally within the enterprise, but also on the nocode.tech site itself, the biggest problem is it's almost too good to be true. People have kind of spent the last 10 years watching stuff like The Social Network and, kind of starting to come to some sort of familiarity with Silicon Valley and the way people work there and the things people do. And so when you kind of turn around and say, well, actually, you can build all this complicated software yourself and it's not just the, 14-year-old whiz kids at Harvard, people tend to need a little bit of convincing to understand that. And the way we've been approaching it, certainly in Lloyds, is by, starting off small, showing people, building it for them, showing people what it can actually do, and then sort of worrying less about the software and more about the mentality. So there's this kind of concept of systems thinking. And systems thinking to me, and there's probably a systems thinker who's going to listen to this and think that I'm really vilifying him here, but systems thinking to me is essentially taking the way that a programmer thinks, that real logic, object, system-based approach, and applying that to business problems. And systems thinking essentially is the concept of looking at a process as a whole, looking at your job or your department or the work that you do and thinking about it from step 1 all the way through to step 10, whatever it may be, thinking, how does work come into this system? How does it flow through? How is it outputted? And then based off the back of that, trying to make some adjustments to your process or that kind of thing. And I think the best thing you can do in terms of adopting NoCode or adopting a tool like FormStack is to first teach people to think like this, to think in terms of process and how you fix that process or how you improve that process. And then for me, FormStack, NoCode, this kind of thing, that's just giving them the tools to do what they can already imagine.
I love that idea of teaching people how to think about process. I know for me, my general nature is, I see a problem, I just kind of dive into the mess and I don't really know what I'm going to do or how I'm going to solve it. And then I start to tinker around with processes. And then eventually I can kind of pull back out, zoom back out and say, all right, I think I can see how can a process come together. How do you teach that? How do you get people really thinking that way?
I think it's definitely a tricky problem, and it's one that I'm spending a lot of time trying to figure out at the minute. For me, it's very much about speaking to someone about the kind of work they do, have them describe what they're up to, who they speak to on a daily basis, and just sort of mapping that out. And then the thing I start to do is really just challenge the assumptions and sort of peel away at things. Okay, so why do you use that file? Why do you have to speak to, Barbara in accounting? Why does it take as long as this? And it's really about pulling someone out of the work that they do every day to almost a sort of, eagle eye from above of, okay, let's look at it together. Let's figure out why you do every sort of step. And I think when you're improving a process or when you are trying to do systems thinking or create a bit of software, the most important thing you can do is cut out things you don't need. There's no point going and looking at a process that someone does and saying, okay, we're going to replace that with software or we're going to give you a software tool to do it. If you don't first look and say, well, do you have to be doing this? Actually, can we cut 50% of it out? Can we make it easier? And I think it's just really about make it feel relevant to someone. You don't want to kind of come in and talk about systems thinking as this big concept. You want to just look at what's the work that you do today? How can you do it differently? If we actually look at it and examine it, what are the bits you could pick out or what are the parts that you don't have to do that you could do differently, you could pass off to someone else? And I think it's really just, there's a real growth there of you start small with a little bit of work, you build up from there, and hopefully, and this is a bit, I guess, the jury's still out on for me, I'm still working on this, but hopefully people start to take an understanding on what you're doing, understand the techniques and get it from there and, eventually apply it themselves.
One of the things you are talking about is this idea of reimagining work, because as you give people tools and really the mindset to redo processes, even observe that there are broken processes or slow processes, you're really helping them advance the way that they do their work, saving time, which is ultimately saving money. How do you think this is kind of going to impact workers around the world going forward?
There's this concept called Crossing the Chasm. It was a book by, I think it was Geoffrey Moore. And the idea is that when a new piece of technology comes out, there are early adopters, and then over time, the more kind of conservative people pick it up and adopt it. And I think if you zoom out and look at that from the business world, then, and this is a pretty obvious thing to say, but startups small companies, individual entrepreneurs, these people pick up technology first, and then over time it's adopted into the enterprise. The interesting thing for me, and the way I kind of tend to think about it, is if you go back, say a century ago, maybe to the 1800s or 1900s, even as recently as sort of the 50s, the 70s, if you wanted to create a big business, if you wanted to make one of these, say, tech companies, something the size of Google or Facebook, then you needed to own a factory. And that was going to cost you millions or whatever it might have been adjusted to back in the day. But then if you go back to just the year 2000, actually all you need is a laptop. Your laptop becomes your factory. And if you go back to, even as recent as 2015, okay, you had your laptop, but you needed to spend, months and months learning to code. You needed to spend a lot of money on servers and all this other infrastructure that would let you run a business. And then actually, if you zoom forward to now, literally all you need is a laptop. You can take anyone in this day and age who is familiar with something like Microsoft Office, anyone who's got the skills to use Word, Excel, PowerPoint, you can now take those people and have them using a no-code tool and get to the point where actually they can create software. And so that's really, really powerful for small businesses, right? Your average Joe now can come online, come to a website like NoCode or YouTube or something like that, watch a few tutorials, learn how to use these tools, and within a few days they can have their own business up and running. And I think as the enterprise starts to adopt that, then quickly you're going to go away from this concept of the business and IT, where you have one group of people who are completely non-technical, take nothing to do with the tech, they simply make requests and they get something back. And you have this other group of people who are IT, who, are the guardian angels of technology, who hold the keys and all the software, who know everything there is to know. And actually, both of those premises are wrong. There are people in IT who know nothing about business. There are people in the business who know nothing about IT, and kind of, the twain shall never meet. No-code is all about bridging that gap, and no-code is essentially going to allow more and more people in the business to prototype things, to better communicate their ideas, to eventually start to, for example, replace some of the processes they might use in areas like finance and accounting and HR. And on the IT side, there are projects which a no-code tool could complete in a day, which IT are currently spending, hundreds of thousands on. And that's where I think the really big impact is going to be over the next 2-3 years, as people start to really get over that small software hurdle. I'm not saying no-code is ready to take on the big time yet. You're not going to build the next Google and no-code necessarily, not the next Facebook, but you might start it there. And I think when you look within the enterprise, there are a lot of little projects, a lot of things here and there. There are so many people in there with so many ideas, so many things that just don't ever see the light of day because the enterprise is too big.
So, I will tend to tell people, if you can learn some of just the advanced, really formulas in Excel, you can get a lot accomplished that, otherwise you're going to think, I've got to go use a developer or an engineer to get this done. And yet it's actually built for the non-technical user. You need to learn a little bit of what's the nomenclature, what are the words. But if you can do that, you can solve some pretty interesting problems and pretty fast. You can speed up efforts. I'm curious how you're seeing no-code really do this exact same thing for people, and maybe some examples of where you've seen no-code be successful.
I think the Excel analogy is spot on. We've seen a lot of people adopting no-code who traditionally, mucked around with macros and Excel or that kind of thing. And one of the interesting places we're kind of seeing it used at the minute is, within the enterprise, a lot of people who've been responding to COVID-19 and that kind of thing, as it's happened across the world really, and disrupted operations and disrupted places like call centers and this kind of thing. We've seen a lot of people trying to use no-code to bridge some of the gaps with the technology they now have, working from home and that kind of thing. A really good example, and it's a really, really simple one, but we heard it from a call center. Typically, if you are working in an operational environment and you want to make sure that calls have been answered in time and that kind of thing, you'll usually have a bunch of agents. They are taking calls. They all have a little kind of turret set up next to the computer. It brings the next call in. They can put people in queue. They can take a break if they need to go to the bathroom, etc. And the way that you would tend to monitor productivity in that environment is you have a manager, and they look up from their computer monitor and they look around and they see everyone, and they see who looks busy and they see who doesn't, they see who's chatting, etc. And the minute you go to remote working from home, that kind of becomes impossible. You might have status codes coming from the kind of soft phone software, etc. But for the vast majority of industries where people are traditionally managed by other people in a very sort of, oversight kind of way that's kind of maybe different from, say, how a lawyer or a doctor works, it becomes really, really difficult to monitor productivity. And so one of the things that we've seen is just people building tools for this kind of use case. We've seen someone build a sort of tool that let people write down what kind of calls they were getting, how long they were spending on them, where they were sort of, taking breaks to go do this thing or the other thing. These kind of tools, I think in this specific example, it probably took about a day to build. I think this was using Retool, which is kind of one of the more popular internal tool builders. And that was literally just a day's work and probably a sort of 5% productivity gain. And when you look at the kind of drop-offs people are seeing, especially in the enterprise world, as a result of COVID-19, that kind of thing is massive. And previously that would have been, let's go speak to a software vendor, let's go bring in some, £500,000 piece of software to do it. Or it would have been an Excel macro, difficult to use, difficult to have multiple people editing at the same time. Someone's got to bring it all together, take 400 agents' Excel spreadsheets and figure out who was spending what where. And, the minute you start talking about that, you quickly see how some of the solutions that are available today, like Excel, as amazing as they are, they get convoluted, they get expensive, they get really tricky to run. That's a really good example of something that NoCode just takes away, because, you kind of imagine if you took everybody within your organization who knows how to do Excel macros and you gave them the ability to build software, what kind of difference is that going to make for your business in a month or a year,
As you know, there are mindsets that already exist out there of people who they can envision the process and how it's supposed to go. They may just not have spent the time to learn how to code. And so you're really just bridging that gap, and kind of this beautiful thing. I'm curious, how have you been able to see no-code actually impact some of your company goals at Lloyds?
Probably the biggest advantage that it brings to us is when we look at internal systems and internal software. Lloyds is a company of somewhere around 65,000 people. And the hometown that I grew up in, which is a place called Kilmarnock in Scotland, good luck pronouncing that one, that's about 44,000 people. So you quickly kind of look at a company that size and go, that is huge. That is really gigantic. And the level of sort of internal processes and hierarchies and little groups here and there that have got a little bit of knowledge but don't know about this other group or that kind of thing, just the sheer size of complexity that emerges in a system as big as that, be it Lloyds, be it any other organisation, it really is just immense. And where we're really, really seeing the benefit is not trying to come in and say, okay, how can we replace this big system with no code, or how can we deliver something to a customer with no code, but actually just first of all looking at the individual person on the ground and saying, let's just give this person the skills that they need. Let's make it really easy for them to build something. Let's make sure we've got some guardrails in place that mean that people can, they're not going to build some bit of software that's got some bug in it that a coder would have spotted instantly. Let's keep it safe, but actually let's just empower the person on the ground, because that's kind of what the technology is about. The thing that kind of gets bandied around in the no-code space is no-code is all about democratizing access to building software. And it can be really tempting in an organization to come in at a high level and look down and say, okay, we see these 5 projects, we're going to apply no code to them, and that might save us money or make them go faster. But actually, I think the really interesting thing is when you do it bottom up, you just give people the tools, you give people the environment, you give them the guardrails, but you say to them, okay, now you've got this power, how can you use it to save us money? How can you use it to help improve our processes to make things go faster? And we're absolutely at the early stages of that in Lloyds Banking Group, but the results already have been really, really incredible.
Well, earlier you mentioned some great sets of tools, Bubble, Parabola, Airtable. Like there's all kinds of varieties of ways really you can tackle this. I'm curious, are there some use cases that you think about no code fast, because this may be the way you get the problem solved faster?
I think the scope of no-code is really, really big now. The majority of people are either building a mobile app or a website with it. And there's a lot of people who would build, say, a marketplace, which is something like Airbnb or eBay, where you have kind of consumers who want to, rent an apartment or buy a product, and then you have sellers who want to rent out their apartment or sell a product. And no-code is becoming really, really good at those kind of things. And I think a marketplace is a good example of a business that's really, really complex to build, because there are, there's buyers, there's sellers, there's transactions, etc. But now there are no-code platforms like ShareTribe, like Adalo, which can let you build this, which make it really, really simple and just take away all the complexity of that business logic.
As you think about really helping people, as people get into no code, as they start to use it in their everyday life, what do you think are some of the things where it actually can go maybe off the rails a little bit and you need to help bring it in and kind of keep some guardrails? Are you seeing places where that's happening?
So I think, the thing about no code is, as much as you're dragging and dropping, you are in some ways still coding. You still have to think about the little bugs or the little quirks of behavior that emerge. And, when you're programming, one of the things people often say about developers is, they'll make an estimate, and then that estimate may as well be, plus or minus 100% of the time. If the developer says it's going to be 2 weeks, then it might be 4, for example. And the reason for that is, when you actually really, really start to get into something, you start thinking about all of the edge cases and all of the things that could go wrong or might not go wrong. For example, let's say you're building a login system. You start writing the part that lets you, put in your full name, or lets your user put in their full name. But then you start to think, well, actually, I need to think about how long am I going to let that name be? But actually, if I let that be too long, then am I going to be crowding out someone who, for example, doesn't have a typical Western name? Am I going to be missing certain characters from, say, Cyrillic or a language like that? And you start to get into all these little, what ifs. And that's where the real impact of programming is. That's why it takes so long and why it's so complicated. And the problem with no code is it doesn't take that away. But what you are doing is giving these tools to people who haven't necessarily had that experience before, because they haven't programmed, they don't necessarily know that you're going to bump into these pitfalls. And so, that can be a real danger. And then you get some other things which are sort of well known, for example, security concerns or things like that. Again, a lot of coders know, but people from the no-code space are just not familiar with yet. I'll give you an example. Let's say you forget your password on a website and you go to the forgotten password, and sometimes it'll say, give me an email address, and you put your email address in, and then one of two things happens. Either it pops up like most websites do and says, if an email address with that account exists, then we'll send you an email that you can reset your password, or it will say that email address was correct but the password was wrong, or some sort of flavour of that. And the problem with that second option is, essentially it can tell a hacker or an attacker that email address does have an account here. And so if let's say, for example, you are one of most people who, reuse the same password for everything, and I know your password, I don't know what accounts you've got your typical email address set up to, I can just go start trying you in Facebook, I can go start trying you, all these different places. And it's called user enumeration, and it's one of these little security quirks that most people don't know about, you wouldn't think about, but actually, whether you're using code, whether you're using no code, your system's still vulnerable to that kind of attack.
Yeah, it sounds like there are just some new and interesting ways that people have to, just start to think about things in terms of security. So that's a great example. As someone who is listening right now, they might feel a bit overwhelmed, a bit, like excited about the opportunities that you've talked about, but really they're not sure where to start. What do you suggest as a first step to using no-code kind of solutions?
Well, the obvious first step I've got to recommend is my own website. If you go to nocode.tech/learn, then we've packed in kind of over 500 different lessons on, using a bunch of different tools, building mobile apps, building web apps, etc. But, more conceptually, I really have to say that the best thing to do is start small. Build a small bit of software. Don't necessarily jump into your dream project that's, a marketplace for cars where you're going to have to, look up license plates or check for car makes and models and all this kind of thing. Keep it simple. What's a simple thing you can start with? Why don't you build the website for your idea? Or, once you've built the website for your idea, why don't you try connecting that to a service? Let's say you've got your website for your car marketplace, you've got a sign up button, that connects you through to a newsletter. Now you can email people. For me, it's really building up step by step. And one of the stacks that we call it, and a stack is essentially a collection of different tools that you might use to achieve a kind of a no-code project to build something. But one of the most popular ones out there is called the WAMS stack. That's actually what it's called. And it stands for Webflow, Airtable, MemberStack, and Zapier. And Webflow lets you build websites. Airtable kind of acts as a database with a kind of Excel-like interface. MemberStack allows you to have login and logout features, users essentially on any website. And then Zapier lets you connect into tons of different services, and I believe FormStack may well be one of them. But that's a really, really good way actually of going through the different levels, So build your website with Webflow, and then get a Webflow form, sending data through to Airtable. Then use MemberStack to build a login. Then use Zapier to do, whatever it is, send data to different places, maybe link it in with, Stripe for payments or PayPal or something like that. But that stack's a really, really good way to build no-code software and one of the go-tos, but actually it's also a really nice incremental way to learn how to do it.
I love that idea of grabbing really a few great tools, products, and helping people kind of think about, if you'll learn this framework, really, you're going to be way ahead in terms of being able to start coding effectively. And so I love that idea. Well, as we begin to wrap up, I've got a couple questions for you. First, what's the number one piece of advice for embracing simplicity in business processes?
So the concept I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I can't profess to being an expert in it, it's quite difficult, but I've been thinking a lot about high leverage actions. What are when I'm thinking of doing a task, what is the highest leverage possible way that I could do that task? Let's say I've got a business that's got a team, and currently every day I check all the customer support emails. And if they are, basic inquiries like, can I get a refund? Then I ping that onto my customer support team. And if they are, more complex inquiries like, do you make this wardrobe in mahogany or walnut or something? Then I handle that myself because, I'm the business owner and I know everything in my head, etc. The high leverage is all about, instead of answering that email, I should use my answer to that email to create a standard operating procedure, a document or a process that I write down so that the next time that question comes in, I can just hand it off to the customer support person. And so it might mean that task takes, an hour instead of 5 minutes, but that just happens once. And instead of that now being a task that I do 5 minutes every day, it's now a 1 hour task I do once and never again. And so high leverage is all about thinking, what is the best way that I can spend my time or that I can approach a task to mean that my business is going to grow or that I can spend my time on other areas or otherwise just not think about this task again.
All right. And what is your kind of go-to productivity tip for others?
Oh, that's a difficult one. So I probably have tried tons of different productivity tips, tons of different productivity tools. And the one that just keeps coming back to me, everyone talks about this kind of idea of flow state, and, that you get into the mood, you can get things done. And for me, the best way to achieve that is every day I make a to-do list. It starts off with really, really simple stuff that I do every day, like get up, work out, shower, and I'll literally put shower on my to-do list as if I'm going to forget that. I'll put lunch on there, I'll put, all these little basics, I'll put tidy up, I'll put this away. And they're these tiny little items that take 2 seconds. But what it means is I'm quickly accumulating these little ticks, and that really gives me this feeling of productivity. And I might have, 5 boxes or 5 items ticked, like, take my lunch out the fridge or shower or work out. And it's never, it's not stupid things that are really, really small, like, put my shoes on. But very quickly, I've done the basics that set me up for a good day, like working out, etc. I've got this little to-do list of stuff that's starting to get ticked down. And it really, really gives me energy and this kind of feeling of forward momentum as I start to get into my day and start tackling, the really important business tasks of the day.
All right. Well, how will you be reimagining your own work moving forward?
So for me, the thing I really try to do is think about, number one, for everything I do, how can it turn into a piece of software or an automation or something that runs in the background? Someone, I can't remember who it was, but someone once said that, a data center is kind of like a little army of robots who just do whatever you want them to do. And so everything I'm doing every day, I'm trying to think, how can I get a robot to do that tomorrow? How can I get a robot to do that the next day? Or how can I build a little bit of software, a little bit of something running in the background that's going to make this easier? And the more and more I do that, it really, really shapes how I start to do things, how I implement features, how I implement, marketing concepts or marketing strategies. Everything that I try to do now is automated so that it runs again and again. It can, go on in the background. I don't have to worry about it, and I can keep thinking about the new things, the next thing, the thing I'm going to do tomorrow.
Well, as we wrap up this episode featuring Nile Frater, there are a couple takeaways that I have heard from this conversation. The first is he provided a great definition for us of low code versus no code. And low code really is about enabling people who probably have a little bit of technical skill really just to speed up getting the work done. And no code is really about enabling people in that more drag and drop way to get some pretty complicated processes built in software and get processes kind of moving quickly. The other one was this idea that we really need to step back and think about what is the highest leverage we can get in this moment. I love that idea. Leverage is this idea that the boulder is too big for us to move by ourselves, but if we can get the lever, we might actually be able to move it. And I love that idea and how no-code tools can really help make that happen. And maybe one other one is just this idea that look around your organization at things that you run on Excel or Google Sheets and ask the question, is this something we can get going in some sort of no-code tool or solution? Well, I want to invite you all to join us for Season 2 of Ripple Effect. This season, we're unlocking the stories of people and organizations around the world doing one thing exceptionally well, and that's reimagining work. How can you reimagine your work for the better? Join us this season and find out.